Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the co-owner and creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and in this video, I want to talk specifically more about the topic of retraumatization and some examples of how the fearful avoidant tends to re-traumatize themselves. And so I did a little bit of well, not really a little bit, a sort of in-depth earlier video about retraumatization and how it occurs. And I received an enormous amount of requests asking me to talk about how it occurs across the different attachment styles specifically and to give some more examples so people had something to work on and work with. So this is what this video is going to be about. Before I dive in, we're still doing a sale to support our community right now. The coupon code is with you, all one word. I'll put a link to just go right to it in the video here. Our courses for July coming up. So we just launched in June a conscious parenting course and also an in-depth subconscious reprogramming course where we go through 21 different tools for how to reprogram your subconscious mind, how to isolate problems you're facing in any single one of the 7 areas of life, and what to do with it. And even the different ways of recognizing when we're in trance, when we're sort of in this space where we are on autopilot and running old pain points, old stories, and how to be able to sort of wake up out of that and become conscious and aware and reprogram at a deep subconscious level what's not serving. So our courses for this next month, for July coming up, are a course in communication. So all about communication and scripts. And basically what we're going to go through is we're going to talk all about how to communicate in different scenarios for different attachment styles. And it's just going to be scripts of like directions to follow, modeled scenarios, and basically an in-depth synopsis of that. And then also a course in overcoming loneliness, the science of connecting deeply with others, and really what's required, all the different things that affect us when it comes to connection, body language, tone of voice, micro expressions, intentions, subconscious programs, all these different components, and how to do a deep dive into that. So that is exciting stuff. Before I dive into this video, I also want to let you guys know that if you're looking to do a deeper dive into retraumatization and what it is, you can watch a previous video I have that I'll also link in the description box here below, so that you have a really wide-ranging context for this, okay? So let's talk about the fearful avoidance specifically. So retraumatization, just at a very high level, is this concept or idea that I've sort of come up with. It's a word I've invented to represent the fact that our subconscious mind continuously recreates trauma from the past in the present. And it does this in an autopilot format at the emotional level without meaning to. It's not like your subconscious is trying to give you a hard time or create pain. And it's not that your subconscious mind is the problem. It's the tapes that are in it that are the problem, right? The imprints that took place within that container of your subconscious mind that become the problem or challenge. But what happens is when we go through trauma, and in the words of Dr. Gabor Mate, trauma is the things that happened that shouldn't have happened, or the things that didn't happen that should have happened. Okay, so for example, abuse could be an imprint of trauma, right? Verbal abuse, let's say. And how that imprints your subconscious is that you might have really painful stories you make up about yourself because of that terrible thing that took place. And then it can also be emotional neglect, something that didn't happen that should have happened and really was necessary to progress effectively through the stages of behavioral development as a child, and even cognitive development to a certain degree. So when we have these imprints, what the mind does is it becomes really hypervigilant around them and develops these almost like hardened, you can think of a tough shell of a coping mechanism. But anything that we've got protected by a tough shell, we're not nourishing. If you can imagine your subconscious is like a field, if you've got these hard shells around these seeds that you've planted, like let's say they're encapsulated in like a metal box, obviously those seeds are not getting watered. They're not getting nourished. They're not getting the nutrients from the soil. They're not going to grow and thrive, even though you've planted them. And you can think of like traumatic events as doing the same thing. And trauma doesn't have to be these like crazy, horrid events. Trauma is really just anything that we couldn't properly emotionally process and make sense of at the time that it occurred. And so we created this encapsulation around it, this protective mechanism. And really what that is at the behavioral level is just an automatic coping skill. So let's say, for example, you had a lot of yelling at you in your home. Maybe your automatic coping skill was to literally avoid conflict at all costs. And so that coping mechanism prevents you from emotionally nourishing yourself and growing in that area. Just like that seed encapsulated, right? You have such a knee-jerk reaction, something that's programmed in to cope, to survive, to withdraw from conflict, that you prevent yourself from learning important life lessons and tools that we would need to grow, like assertiveness and how to set boundaries and how to communicate when something doesn't feel good to you because you're so terrified of conflict, right? So wherever we have these automatic coping mechanisms, we're not growing in those areas. And you can think of yourself as being emotionally stunted in that specific arena. So we want to find these things in our subconscious mind, and we want to remove that encapsulation through reprogramming, and we want to actually create change so we can nourish and create new patterns and keep emotionally growing in a way of wholeness, not in a way where we super grow in some areas, but we're really stunted in others and imbalanced in some because we're in automatic trance coping mechanism protection mode at a subconscious level. So some major ones that I see, okay, and there are going to be all sorts of different types of retraumatization that take place for different attachment styles just based on the unique individual, because not every single person who's fearful avoidant, let's say, gets bullied in childhood, right? But some do and some don't. But what I can tell you is there tend to be specific core factors that take place where we've got those encapsulated mechanisms, those coping mechanisms, and fearful avoidants are not growing in those areas. And so they feel emotionally young or stunted a lot of the time in these specific arenas. The arenas that I've seen in a pattern format that are very prevalent for fearful avoidance are lack of boundaries. Boundaries were often violated a lot as a child or in early adult life or in a previous relationship if you became fearful avoidant in your adult life after some kind of painful, traumatic relationship you went through. And it's from here that usually you learn to keep violating your own boundaries. You learn to love through an enmeshed sort of lens, right? So you keep re-traumatizing yourself on autopilot because you keep violating your own boundaries the way that they were violated against you, essentially. And you keep doing that in relationship to yourself on autopilot all day long. And this is what keeps these wounds originally alive. If we weren't firing and wiring these same neural pathways, if we weren't repeating the same behaviors that happened to us, then internalized and in the relationship to ourselves, then these things would go away. They wouldn't still be here from the past. The past is gone. But the only way that we're still experiencing the past is literally because we fired and wired these same things and kept those pathways and paradigms and perceptual filters and ways of behaving alive through the recreation of them at a subconscious level. So boundaries, disowning sense of self. Usually you were forced to make sacrifices. You were made to feel like a burden, so you make yourself feel like a burden to other people. If you need anything or would want to ask for anything, you become hyper independent instead. Usually your lack of boundaries as well is or disowning sense of self as well is that you had to disown your sense of self to like hyper attune to somebody else who was in pain or trouble or somebody you were made responsible for where you necessarily shouldn't have been. And so that disowning of your sense of self, you keep repeating on autopilot, right? Especially when you're around other people, maybe not when you're alone. And that's sometimes why the fearful avoidant likes to withdraw so much and has that avoidance side. But the moment you're around people, you disown your sense of self. You put other people's feelings and needs before others, just like they were put before you when you didn't have control and didn't have a say. Often, a huge thing that fearful avoidants go through that I could make a full separate video about is you believe because of the way you've been conditioned to relate to others and because you've learned to love through enmeshment or you've been loved through an enmeshed dynamic, you re-traumatize yourself that way because you learn only to love through that same dynamic. And so you have this thing that takes place a lot of the time. And this is why fearful avoidants can often spend large portions of their lives out of relationships and really trying to like stay alone and not get into a relationship. Usually you've come to believe or experience that if you get back into a romantic relationship, you don't trust yourself to set boundaries essentially at a subconscious level. And you believe that it's either me and me keeping my sense of self when I'm alone, or the moment I love, I lose myself again. And so there's this idea that it's like the moment I get into a romantic relationship, it's mutually exclusive. It's either relationship to self or relationship to somebody else. There's no in between. And what that actually is an act of retraumatization where you want to pull these things up and you want to become aware that these beliefs are existing and that you lose yourself when you go into relationships. That's why relationships feel so hard sometimes. And that's why you often feel so imbalanced in your giving and receiving, because you give up yourself. And of course, at a subconscious level, you would then expect somebody to do the same and feel deeply offended if they don't, because conflict is born of a perception of imbalance. And so fearful avoidants very often need to work on their boundaries, because they set one big boundary because they're afraid of all the little boundaries that they might violate underneath. And don't necessarily trust themselves to set boundaries on a regular basis, be in touch with their feelings and needs on a regular basis. Our boundaries course in the school goes through boundaries in tremendous detail, from how to identify a boundary, to how to reprogram yourself to be able to set boundaries, to how to communicate your boundaries, to the boundaries, the different types of boundaries, ingoing boundary violations, outgoing, the 7 different boundary types, boundaries in all 7 areas of life, like so many different components. And it's extremely, extremely important, if you're struggling with this, to do a deep dive into boundaries and understand what that means to you. Other ways that fearful avoidants re-traumatize themselves: they keep themselves unseen and unheard by others. Okay? Usually you were unseen and unheard at some point, and you keep yourself that way by not expressing, but also by being afraid to receive. You keep yourself unworthy. You usually got an imprint of feeling unworthy, and you keep yourself unworthy by overcompensating for things in your relationship, by trying to earn your worth from other people, when in action, just doing that at a deep subconscious level emotionally infers that you must be unworthy if you think you have to earn it. Often you'll think that you are undeserving to a certain degree, and so you won't receive, you won't ask for things, you won't just allow yourself to feel naturally deserving of good things that happen. Often you'll feel like, oh, the other shoe's going to drop if something good is happening. And these are patterns you have to break. If you don't break these things, then these are just going to show up, because your subconscious mind, which is running your brain and your actions and emotions and behaviors 95 to 97% of the day, is going to recreate painful cycles, because it's what's familiar, it's what's comfortable, and anything that is familiar and comfortable, your subconscious identifies as safe and actively works to recreate, even though your conscious mind might, vehemently desire otherwise. Some other key components of where the FA re-traumatizes is in their unmet needs for consistency, safety, and peace. Often you had a lot of inconsistency in childhood. Often you had a lack of safety and feeling just safe and settled in, and a lack of peace. And usually, if you pay close attention, you're living your life by those same sort of principles on autopilot beneath the surface, but they're just existing in different forms, so you might not recognize. So often you move around a lot. You don't stay settled in the same place. You need a lot of inconsistency, which can be great because you're totally entitled to your own freedom and your own needs that way. But usually it actually teeters on like, ooh, there's a lack of structure, a lack of stability, a lack of safety eventually from some of those patterns. And often you're used to the roller coaster. And so you keep recreating the roller coaster in different forms, always running late, always in drama, always, there can be these sort of underlying factors bubbling beneath the surface. And then, of course, we have our retraumatizations in the form of painful stories. So the same hypervigilant meanings we give to things when there's a shift or change in a pattern. Somebody's acting differently than usual. They must be cheating. They must be betraying me. They must be lying to me. These sorts of components that basically are the offshoot of our core wounds. So I will make another couple of videos for the anxious preoccupied and for the DA, just about like the specific patterns and ways that you tend to be re-traumatizing yourself, so you can have some like clear awareness. Our courses go in depth into all of this. Our subconscious reprogramming courses with workbooks, worksheets, steps, everything. So I highly recommend doing a deep dive into that if you're looking. And please like, share, and subscribe if you're getting a lot of value out of this channel. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of this community and for watching. And I will see you in the next video.